March 9, 1945, Mariana Islands, Pacific Ocean. As the sun sets over the American airfields on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, the runways come alive with motion. Ground crews move quickly across the tarmac, conducting final checks on an enormous fleet of 325 Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers, each one preparing for a mission unlike any that had come before. Major General Curtis LeMay, commander of the 21st Bomber Command, has just authorized a daring shift in bombing strategy, the most radical of the entire Pacific War. Each aircraft carries a bomb bay packed beyond its normal limits with cluster incendiary munitions, holding a total of 1,520 M69 napalm bomblets per plane. Each of these canisters is designed to ignite at a blistering 1,800 verif, capable of turning entire city blocks into infernos. Their destination: Tokyo's Shitamachi district, a crowded working-class area of tightly packed wooden homes housing over 750,000 civilians within 12 square miles. At exactly 1735 hours, the first gleaming B-29 rumbles down the runway at Guam's North Field and climbs into the fading light. Soon, hundreds follow, one after another roaring into the sky on the power of Wright R-3350 engines, their formation scattered, each aircraft flying independently to maximize efficiency. Most of their defensive guns have been stripped away to make room for a doubled payload of incendiaries. At the head of the armada fly the Pathfinder aircraft, whose task is to drop flares and form a blazing X visible from miles away. This mark will guide the main wave of bombers, which will release their deadly cargo from just 5,000 to 7,000 feet, a dangerously low altitude for such heavy planes. What will soon unfold over Tokyo will not only demonstrate the terrifying effectiveness of America's incendiary bombing campaign, but also expose the desperate limits of Japan's air defenses. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress represented the peak of aviation technology during World War II. It was a marvel of engineering, the product of more than 1.4 million design hours and an investment exceeding $3 billion, a cost greater even than the Manhattan Project's $1.9 billion. This four-engine heavy bomber was the most advanced aircraft ever fielded, featuring innovations unheard of at the time: pressurized cabins, remote-controlled gun turrets, and the most powerful piston engines ever installed on a plane. Production was a nationwide effort. Boeing built aircraft in Seattle, Renton, and Wichita. The Glenn L. Martin Company produced them in Omaha, and Bell Aircraft assembled more in Marietta, Georgia. Each B-29 measured 99 feet long with an impressive 141-foot wingspan, and its four Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines delivered a combined 8,800 horsepower. Capable of carrying up to 20,000 pounds of bombs, the aircraft could strike targets 1,600 miles away, cruising at altitudes of up to 31,850 feet and reaching speeds of 357 miles per hour. By March 1945, around 2,000 B-29s were already in operational service, with American factories racing toward the wartime total of 3,970 units. The sheer speed of production illustrated America's unmatched industrial capacity. Boeing's Wichita plant alone was rolling out an average of 4.2 Superfortresses every working day. The 20th Air Force, commanded directly by General Henry Hap Arnold, had first deployed B-29s from bases in China in mid-1944, later moving operations to the Mariana Islands once those were captured from Japan in November of the same year. From these islands, the 21st Bomber Command operated three massive bombardment wings, the 73rd and 313th based on Saipan, and the 314th on Guam. Together, they could send more than 300 bombers into the air for a single mission, each maintained by teams of skilled ground crews working tirelessly, often around the clock. Japan, in contrast, was woefully unprepared to defend against such an assault. By early 1945, its air defense network was in disarray, divided between the Imperial Army and Navy, which operated under separate command structures with almost no coordination. Japan's principal night fighter, the Nakajima J-1N Gecko, Moonlight, had been hastily modified from a reconnaissance aircraft, armed with twin 20mm Type 99 cannons firing upward at a 30-degree angle, and another pair firing downward. It could, in theory, attack bombers from unconventional directions. Yet only 479 units were ever built, and many had already been destroyed. Another model, the Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu, Dragon Slayer, featured a 37mm nose cannon and oblique 20mm guns, but a mere 1,171 had been produced since 1941. Lacking airborne radar, Japanese night fighters depended on searchlights and visual sighting, a nearly impossible feat when facing swift, high-flying bombers cloaked by darkness. The ground-based defenses were no better. Tokyo, the world's largest city, had fewer than 500 heavy anti-aircraft guns to defend its entire metropolitan region. A heavy 88 mm anti-aircraft gun formed the backbone of Japan's high-altitude defenses, while lighter 20 mm cannon provided close-in protection, though the latter had an effective ceiling of only about 11,500 feet. Most critically, however, Japan lacked fire control radar for its anti-aircraft batteries. Instead, defenders relied on optical rangefinders and acoustic locators, devices that proved essentially useless in bad weather or at night. The raw numbers made the problem plain. From the Marianas, the United States could field hundreds of B-29s at once. By contrast, Japan could only muster perhaps 200 operational night fighters across the home islands in March 1945. Chronic fuel shortages sharply limited training flights, leaving many new pilots with virtually no night flying experience. Aviation gasoline was so scarce that entire squadrons were grounded simply to conserve fuel for the desperate defensive sorties authorities expected if an American invasion ever came. Major General Curtis LeMay had taken command of the 21st Bomber Command in January 1945 and inherited a strategic bombing campaign that had not produced decisive results. High-altitude precision attacks launched from roughly 30,000 feet had been repeatedly foiled by the jet stream. Winds in excess of 200 miles per hour routinely scattered bombs miles away from their intended aims. Climbing to those altitudes with heavy bomb loads also strained the B-29's engines. Magnesium alloy components overheated, provoking frequent mechanical failures. Cloud cover obscured targets roughly 70% of the time, forcing crews to rely on rudimentary radar for aiming. After carefully assessing these operational realities, LeMay adopted an entirely different approach, one radical in its implications, but rational in light of experience. He ordered that nearly all defensive guns be removed from the B-29s, except for the tail guns, allowing each bomber to carry an incendiary load of roughly 7 tons instead of the usual 3.5 tons of high explosives. By operating at lower altitudes between about 5,000 and 9,000 feet, aircrews could avoid much of the jet stream, lessen the strain on engines, and greatly improve bombing accuracy. LeMay also shifted to night operations to reduce exposure to Japanese interceptors, which lacked adequate radar and experienced night pilots. Rather than flying in tight formations, individual aircraft would navigate by low-RAN radio beacons and press the attack in a steady, continuous stream over several hours. Weather forecasts for the night of March 9 to 10 were favorable. Clear skies and strong surface winds that would help spread fires across the targeted districts. Targets were chosen with a deliberate strategic logic. Intelligence officers used maps and urban planning records, many compiled by the Office of Strategic Services, to identify Tokyo wards where numerous small cottage industries manufactured aircraft components, electrical gear, and precision instruments inside workshops that were woven into dense residential neighborhoods. The northeast section of Tokyo, areas including Asakusa, Honjo, and Fukagawa, was singled out. These were overwhelmingly working-class districts, with multi-generation families packed into wooden houses, separated by narrow alleys and little open space. At the center of the operation's destructive capability was the M69 incendiary bomblet, a sophisticated weapon for its time. Each bomblet was essentially a hexagonal steel tube about 3 inches in diameter and roughly 20 inches long, weighing approximately 6 pounds. Unlike earlier incendiaries based on thermite or magnesium, which could burn hotter but were easier to smother, the M69 carried a gelid gasoline napalm mixture developed with input from industrial scientists and university researchers. M69s were loaded into E-46 cluster assemblies, each cluster containing 38 bomblets that separated from the dispenser at about 2,000 feet. On release, each M69 deployed a cotton streamer so the fuse would orient downward. After striking, a short time delay fuse burned for roughly 3 to 5 seconds before a white phosphorus charge ignited and dispersed flaming napalm up to 100 feet in multiple directions. That short delay was intentional. By the time detonation occurred, the cylinder typically lay on its side, maximizing the area covered by burning incendiary material and making it far more likely that flames would leap from house to house and down narrow alleys. Testing at the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah had already confirmed the devastating efficiency of the M69 incendiary. Trials conducted on life-sized replicas of Japanese urban neighborhoods demonstrated its extraordinary destructive power. When deployed, the bomblets ignited multiple fires over a wide area, their napalm adhering tenaciously to every surface it touched. Water-based firefighting efforts proved useless. The sticky, jellied gasoline simply clung to wood, tile, and concrete, burning until everything combustible was consumed. Each B-29 Superfortress carried 40 of these E-46 cluster canisters, collectively containing 521 M69 bomblets. On the night of the Tokyo raid, out of 325 bombers launched, 279 reached the target, an astonishing concentration for such a long-range operation. The mission, codenamed Operation Meetinghouse, would unleash approximately 424,000 individual incendiary devices on the Japanese capital, saturating the city in firebombs with a density unprecedented in history. American planners had calculated the effect with mathematical precision. They estimated that the number and spacing of the M69s would produce not isolated fires, but a self-sustaining firestorm, a massive conflagration in which smaller blazes merged into one all-consuming inferno. The intense heat generated by these merging fires would in turn create powerful winds, feeding oxygen into the flames and driving the destruction far beyond the initial impact zone. The first B-29 lifted off from Guam shortly after 5:30 p.m. on March 9th. It was piloted by Brigadier General Thomas Sarsfield Power, commander of the 304th Bombardment Wing, who led the mission. Over the following hours, bomber after bomber ascended into the evening sky, departing from the 3 Mariana Island bases at carefully timed intervals, roughly one aircraft every 50 seconds. The flight would be long and exhausting, a 14-hour round trip across thousands of miles of ocean. Crews traded their bulky high-altitude cold-weather gear for lighter clothing suited to the warmer temperatures of their new, lower-altitude flight plan. With most defensive guns, gunners, and ammunition removed, the aircraft were significantly lighter, allowing them to climb more efficiently and conserve precious fuel for the 1,500-mile journey to Japan. As they approached the Japanese coastline, the crews glimpsed the snow-covered peak of Mount Fuji, its white summit gleaming faintly in the moonlight, a natural beacon confirming their position. In Tokyo, air raid sirens began to wail around 10:30 p.m., though most residents stayed where they were. Having survived earlier high-altitude raids that caused relatively minor damage, Tokyo's citizens had grown complacent, unaware that this night would bring a new and terrible kind of bombing. The city's civil defense preparations were tragically inadequate. Out of Tokyo's 4.3 million inhabitants, only 18 concrete air raid shelters existed, enough to protect about 90,000 people. The vast majority of residents relied on improvised dugouts or shallow backyard trenches covered with planks, known as bogo, which offered almost no protection from incendiaries. Tokyo's 8,000 firefighters had little more than hand pumps and bucket lines, tools suited for peacetime emergencies, not citywide firestorms. Local neighborhood associations had organized civilian firefighting groups, but these consisted mostly of elderly men, women, and teenagers armed only with sand buckets and small water containers. They were courageous but helpless in the face of what was coming. At 12:08 a.m. on March 10th, the first Pathfinder B-29s appeared over Tokyo, approaching from multiple directions to ensure precision. Flying at just 5,000 feet, they dropped M47 napalm bombs to mark the target area. Within moments, the Pathfinder's bombs ignited enormous fires that merged into a blazing X visible for miles, signaling the main bomber stream to begin its attack. The weather that night proved both perfect and catastrophic, clear skies and surface winds ranging from 17 to 28 miles per hour, with gusts up to 45 miles per hour created ideal conditions for fire to spread uncontrollably. As the main wave of B-29s released their M69 clusters, observers in the sky described a surreal sight, thousands of small metallic objects glittering in the reflected firelight as they fell toward the city. Seconds later, the bomblets detonated, scattering flaming napalm in every direction. Within minutes, tens of thousands of fires erupted across the eastern wards of Tokyo. The strong winds acted like a giant bellows, fanning the flames and driving them from building to building until the entire district became one vast inferno. On the ground, temperatures soared to over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt glass, liquefy metal, and set even asphalt streets ablaze. The rising columns of superheated air created violent updrafts, generating tornado-like fire vortices that sucked oxygen from the streets and hurled burning debris hundreds of feet into the air. Roads became impassable as houses collapsed and entire neighborhoods vanished beneath walls of flame. The sound was deafening, a roaring, consuming noise that drowned out everything else. Smoke and heat reduced visibility to just a few feet. In the Sumida district, 24-year-old Yoshiko Hashimoto was at home with her 13-month-old baby when the air raid began. Her husband, an army officer, was stationed elsewhere in the city on guard duty. Later, she would give a harrowing account of that night for post-war historians. The B-29s were dropping so many firebombs it sounded like heavy rain. I was astonished at the intensity of it. I had never seen anything like it before. As flames swept through the narrow alleys, Yoshiko fled with her parents, her infant, and her sisters, joining thousands of others who tried to escape through the labyrinth of burning streets. The tight wooden neighborhoods of Shitamachi turned into deadly traps, the alleys becoming furnaces as people struggled to push through the crowds. Families were separated in the chaos, children were lost, the elderly fell behind, and firefighters abandoned their equipment when the heat became unbearable.
Reaching the Sumida River, Yoshiko and others saw scenes of utter panic. Burning debris was falling all around us, she later recalled, and the wind kept getting stronger.
Flaming debris filled the air, signboards, furniture, shattered doors, and burning fragments of wood, lifted skyward by the gale-like winds. Warehouses along both banks of the Sumida River were engulfed in flames, the heat radiating outward in waves that seared exposed skin. Yoshiko's father, realizing there was no escape, shoved his daughter and her infant into the river, an act that saved their lives. He, along with Yoshiko's mother and sister, Itsuko, did not survive. Across the city, scenes like this were repeated countless times. Families were torn apart within seconds, their lives erased in the storm of fire. Those who sought refuge in canals or rivers faced another horror. The water itself began to boil, reaching scalding temperatures that made survival uncertain. Thousands rushed toward bridges and waterways simultaneously, many being swept away or crushed in the chaos. The winds created by the inferno were so powerful that they physically hurled people across open streets. Some victims were later found hundreds of meters from where they had first collapsed. As the firestorm expanded, police stations, hospitals, and designated evacuation centers were surrounded and consumed by flames. At Kikukawa Elementary School, one such official shelter, investigators later found only charred fragments of metal and human remains. Hundreds had sought safety there, none survived. Even Buddhist temples that had stood for centuries vanished in the blaze, taking with them the residents who had fled to their sacred halls. The intense heat and lack of oxygen created deadly conditions even inside shelters. The superheated air caused catastrophic lung damage to anyone who breathed it in, even briefly. Survivors later recalled how people suffocated within seconds from the scalding air alone. When the fires finally subsided, the scale of devastation defied comprehension. Casualty figures varied depending on the source. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey calculated 87,793 dead and 40,918 wounded. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department reported 83,793 fatalities with the same number of injured. The Tokyo Fire Department, working from its own records, estimated 97,000 killed and 125,000 injured. Modern historians generally agree that the true death toll exceeded 100,000 lives, a number greater than the immediate casualties caused by either of the atomic bombings that followed later in the war. In total, 267,171 buildings were destroyed, erasing 15.8 square miles of urban Tokyo, fully a quarter of the entire city. More than 1 million survivors were left homeless, wandering through landscapes of ash and twisted metal. The industrial losses were equally catastrophic. Over half of Tokyo's manufacturing had been concentrated in small family-run workshops within the burned-out neighborhoods. Their destruction crippled the city's production of aircraft parts, electrical components, and precision instruments vital to Japan's war effort. Thousands of skilled workers were either killed or displaced, dealing a blow from which Japan's wartime industry never fully recovered. American losses, by contrast, were minimal. Only 14 B-29 bombers failed to return from the mission, with 96 airmen listed as killed or missing. Several bombers encountered violent turbulence from the immense thermal updrafts generated by the fires, which caused loss of control. Others suffered anti-aircraft hits during their low-level bombing runs, though Japanese gunners found it nearly impossible to track fast-moving aircraft at such unusual altitudes. Aircrews reported seeing towering columns of smoke reaching up to their flight levels, thousands of feet above the burning city. Many who had initially doubted General LeMay's drastic new tactics were stunned by the operation's outcome. The scale of the destruction and the visible results of the raid left crews silent during the long flight back to the Marianas. LeMay himself later reflected on the moral burden of what had been done. "I suppose," he admitted, "if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal." His superior, General Henry Hop Arnold, offered only praise. "This shows your crews have the guts for anything." The success of Operation Meetinghouse immediately reshaped American strategy. Within 10 days, similar firebombing raids struck Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe, Japan's other major industrial cities. The campaign paused only briefly, not out of restraint, but because the 21st Bomber Command had nearly exhausted its supply of incendiary munitions. Production of M69 bomblets was instantly ramped up, with American factories given top priority to replenish stockpiles for the continued destruction of Japan's urban centers. By 1945, the gulf between American and Japanese capabilities had become absolute. The United States could replace every B-29 bomber lost in a matter of weeks, while Japan could neither rebuild its shattered cities nor replace the thousands of skilled workers who had perished in them. America's industrial production exceeded Japan's by a factor of 10, and its technological edge made every weapon significantly more effective. The B-29 Superfortress program alone, costing nearly $3 billion, had consumed more money than the entirety of Japan's 1945 military budget. By mid-1945, the United States was producing 50,000 tons of incendiary bombs each month, while Japan struggled to manufacture even basic ammunition for its defense forces. The contrast reflected two completely different approaches to warfare. American operations were methodical, precise, and heavily grounded in science. At Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, U.S. engineers had constructed full-scale replicas of Japanese neighborhoods modeled from pre-war architectural blueprints to test the spread of fire. The Standard Oil Development Company perfected the formulation of napalm through exhaustive chemical research, while scientists from Harvard University and the University of Chicago analyzed how fire propagated through urban environments. This fusion of industrial science and military planning represented a distinctly modern empirical approach to war, one that Japan's leadership, still rooted in traditional ideals of spirit and sacrifice, could neither match nor comprehend. Japan's inability to create effective countermeasures exposed its strategic shortcomings. Even after a preliminary fire raid on February 25 had destroyed 28,000 buildings, authorities made almost no effort to improve fire defenses. Proposals to create firebreaks by demolishing select buildings were rejected. Evacuation plans remained little more than paperwork. Civilian populations were instructed to stay at their posts even when intelligence warned of massive incendiary assaults to come. These failures stemmed from chronic inter-service rivalry and rigid command hierarchies. The Army and Navy each operated in isolation, unwilling to cooperate, while lower-level commanders lacked the authority to act independently. Japan's night fighter force further demonstrated the nation's technological weakness. Pilots like Lieutenant Sakio Endo, credited with 8 B-29 kills, were celebrated as heroes, yet such successes were rare exceptions. Most Japanese night fighter pilots could not even locate their targets in the darkness, particularly once smoke and fire blanketed the skies. Without airborne radar, they depended on ground controllers who used acoustic detection equipment, devices rendered useless once the roar of the firestorm drowned out every other sound. Those who did engage the bombers found their 20mm cannons too weak to penetrate the B-29's armor unless they struck the engines or fuel tanks directly. Some pilots resorted to ramming attacks, sacrificing themselves in desperate attempts to bring down a single aircraft. Tokyo's firefighting system embodied the city's broader infrastructural collapse. The entire capital had only 286 fire engines, most of them hand-operated pumps that required teams of men to function. Water pressure was far too low to reach burning rooftops, and once the bombing began, broken pipes and power outages crippled the entire system. Firefighting procedures emphasized saving individual buildings, an outdated strategy when thousands of fires ignited simultaneously. As the firestorm engulfed eastern Tokyo, fire brigades were quickly overwhelmed. Their vehicles were destroyed, their equipment melted, and their personnel forced to flee. The survivors of the raid experienced deep psychological trauma. Many described a profound loss of faith, not just in the government, but in the entire belief system that had promised protection through devotion and obedience. Refugees leaving Tokyo spread stories of the devastation across the country, contradicting official propaganda that still claimed Japan was winning the war. In the months that followed, factory attendance plummeted as morale collapsed. The phrase routine air raid entered common speech, an acknowledgement that the nightly destruction had become normal. By August 1945, 66 Japanese cities had suffered large-scale incendiary attacks, and much of urban Japan lay in ruins, even before the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The overwhelming success of Operation Meetinghouse profoundly influenced American strategic planning for Operation Downfall, the projected invasion of Japan. Analysts concluded that continued incendiary bombing would wipe out Japan's remaining industrial base by October 1945. General Curtis LeMay believed that air power alone might force surrender, eliminating the need for a costly invasion. By that point, the Joint Chiefs of Staff estimated that conventional bombing had already caused around 900,000 civilian casualties, and that millions more would perish if the war continued. These grim calculations shaped President Harry Truman's thinking on the use of atomic weapons. To him, the bombs were not replacements for conventional firebombing, but extensions of it, an even more decisive psychological tool that might end the war without an invasion. The human consequences, however, transcended all national and strategic considerations. Many American airmen carried emotional burdens long after the war, haunted by memories of the destruction they had witnessed from above. Richard Bale of the 9th Bombardment Group later recalled watching Tokyo burn from his cockpit, an image that never left him. For the Japanese survivors, the suffering was unending. Burn injuries, homelessness, and the loss of entire families left deep scars that endured for generations.
The raid created tens of thousands of orphans and widows, overwhelming relief systems that were already collapsing under wartime strain. Hospitals, schools, temples, and administrative offices in the target zones were obliterated. When dawn broke on March 10th, what had once been the vibrant eastern half of Tokyo was gone. Only skeletons of concrete and brick buildings stood amid miles of ash and melted metal. Survivors wandered through the wasteland searching for familiar landmarks that no longer existed. Many victims could not even be identified. Recovery teams used heavy machinery to clear the debris, and mass funerals continued for weeks. Canals and rivers remained clogged with wreckage and human remains long afterward. The economic toll surpassed all forecasts. Tokyo's eastern wards had contained thousands of small family-run workshops producing precision parts, electrical fittings, and mechanical components essential to Japan's war production. Their annihilation disrupted the supply chains that supported larger factories, while the deaths of experienced craftsmen and machinists, workers who had taken years to train, proved irreplaceable. Even among those who survived, productivity plummeted. Workers faced personal grief, housing shortages, and malnutrition. Factories that remained intact struggled to function, their workforce demoralized and exhausted. By May 1945, after resupplying its incendiary stocks, the U.S. campaign resumed with even greater precision and efficiency. By July, B-29 crews began dropping warning leaflets before raids, listing which cities would be targeted next, a form of psychological warfare designed to break civilian morale and demonstrate total American control of the skies. Japanese defenses steadily deteriorated. Experienced pilots were lost, ammunition supplies depleted, and civil defense systems ceased to function. As Japan's cities burned, the nation's military leaders continued to insist on resistance, even as the means to resist vanished. In the aftermath, historians and legal scholars have debated the operation's moral and legal dimensions. The 1907 Hague Convention forbade attacks on undefended cities, but the definition of defended and the classification of industrial targets remained ambiguous. Operation Meetinghouse, the most destructive air raid in human history, would forever stand at the crossroads between strategic necessity and human tragedy, a moment when technology, science, and total war combined to erase an entire city in a single night.
After the war, international tribunals prosecuted certain Axis leaders for the deliberate targeting of civilians, yet no court addressed the Allied bombing campaigns. The precedent established was that acts of military necessity could justify civilian casualties if the intended goal was strategic. This interpretation deeply influenced the later evolution of international humanitarian law, shaping how civilian harm was viewed even as weapons technology became more precise. The firebombing of Tokyo also revealed the extent to which the Americans had learned to exploit natural conditions for military gain. Weather had played a decisive role in amplifying the operation's impact. The March 9-10 raid was timed deliberately for a period of strong seasonal winds following weeks of dry weather. U.S. meteorologists had studied Japanese weather systems in exhaustive detail, identifying the exact combination of humidity, wind speed, and temperature most likely to produce a massive firestorm. That night, the winds varied between 17 and 45 miles per hour, depending on location, stronger than predicted and ideal for spreading fire. This integration of meteorological science and military strategy epitomized America's methodical, analytical approach to warfare. Yet for the individual B-29 crews, the reality of the mission was far more emotional and chaotic than the planners had envisioned. Many airmen were shaken by what they saw. The smoke from the burning city was visible even at their high cruising altitude, and the turbulence caused by the thermal updrafts was so severe that several pilots barely managed to keep control of their planes. Some crew members later requested reassignment, unable to reconcile what they had witnessed with their personal sense of morality. Others rationalized their role by focusing on the greater strategic aim, ending the war as swiftly as possible. On the ground, the Japanese military response revealed severe structural weaknesses. Anti-aircraft units fired continuously, but achieved little in the choking smoke and darkness. Fighter squadrons managed 90 sorties, but only a handful of intercepts. The Tokyo Fire Department received almost no advance warning about the scale of the attack. Military leaders focused their protection on government and military installations, leaving the residential districts to burn. As communication lines failed and roads were cut off, coordination collapsed completely. Messengers could not move through the inferno. Police, firefighters, and soldiers were left isolated, each acting independently amid the chaos. In the decades that followed, the memory of Tokyo's destruction became a difficult and often overlooked part of global memory. Unlike Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which became symbols of the atomic age, the firebombing of Tokyo remained comparatively obscure outside Japan. Survivors struggled for decades to have their stories acknowledged. One such survivor, Katsumoto Saotome, founded the center of the Tokyo raids and war damage, preserving eyewitness testimonies and ensuring that the voices of those who lived through the disaster would not be forgotten. Commemoration proved complex. Japan's post-war culture sought to honor the civilian dead while also acknowledging the context of a nation that had initiated a war of aggression. The result was a nuanced, often painful memorial narrative that balanced grief, responsibility, and reflection. Military scholars and strategists today still study Operation Meetinghouse as a case study in the capabilities and moral limits of air power. The raid demonstrated that urban destruction alone does not guarantee surrender. Despite the devastation, Japan continued to fight for 5 more months. The operation proved that industrial and technical superiority could overcome geography and distance, but also that in modern total war, the distinction between military and civilian targets can vanish entirely. The shift from precision bombing to area firebombing represented a defining escalation in warfare. The 21st Bomber Command had initially adhered to traditional doctrine, aiming for precise strikes on industrial targets. But after repeated failures, General LeMay ordered the switch to mass incendiary attacks, decisions born not of ideology, but of pragmatism and frustration. By March 1945, urban area attacks had become routine, with targets chosen based on population density and industrial potential rather than purely military significance. The human consequences were incalculable. Survivors lived with psychological trauma that endured for decades. Many who were children during the raid never saw their parents again and spent their lives not knowing their fates. Yoshiko Hashimoto, whose testimony remains preserved in historical archives, expressed what so many felt. "The memory of that night never leaves me. My mother, father, and sister died while my baby and I survived. I think about them every day." The firebombing permanently altered Tokyo's social fabric. Extended families were fragmented, small neighborhood businesses vanished, and entire community networks that had existed for generations were erased in a single night. Historians continue to debate whether strategic bombing alone could have compelled Japan's surrender. What is certain is that the raids accelerated the empire's military collapse. Emperor Hirohito later cited the bombing campaigns and the desperate internal situation as key factors in his decision to surrender. The 100,000 lives lost in Tokyo contributed to ending a war that might otherwise have dragged on, at the cost of millions more. Yet this calculation brings little comfort to those who survived. The story of Operation Meetinghouse encapsulates the transformation of warfare itself, from battles fought by soldiers on front lines to conflicts that consumed entire societies. Cities that had stood for centuries were obliterated in hours by weapons designed and manufactured half a world away. The war that began with expansion and conquest ended with technology targeting the very foundations of civilian life. The disparity between the sophisticated American B-29s and the primitive Japanese defenses symbolized the decisive power of industrialization in modern war. Yet the irony endures. Despite causing the highest single-night death toll of any air raid in history, the firebombing of Tokyo was soon overshadowed by the atomic bombings that followed 5 months later. Because nuclear weapons came to embody the horror of modern warfare, conventional firebombing received far less scrutiny. This relative neglect allowed the continued development of high-yield incendiary and area-effect weapons in later conflicts, devices that inflicted enormous suffering without the stigma attached to atomic arms. The statistics tell only part of the story. 325 B-29s launched, 279 reached Tokyo, 1,665 tons of incendiaries dropped, 15.8 square miles destroyed, 267,171 buildings leveled, 100,000 killed, 1 million displaced. But behind those numbers were individuals, American aircrews carrying out their orders, and Japanese civilians caught in the path of modern warfare's full fury. Operation Meetinghouse remains the most devastating air raid in human history, not merely a military achievement but a somber warning. It stands as evidence of humanity's ability to rationalize total destruction in the name of victory, and of how in an age of industrial-scale conflict, entire populations became the battlefield itself.